this panel is the incredible Debbie Reznick from the Polk Brothers Foundation, who believed in this many months ago to support us in bringing all these folks in from out of town. So Debbie, take it away.
Thank you. I think I'm a believer in Tracy, and I actually wanted to thank her for making this happen today and for all of the other things that she makes happen. It's quite impressive. And as some other folks said today, there is not one answer to how we address youth homelessness or how we address the lack of affordable housing. I think conversations are great. I think this was a great conversation. I really appreciated hearing all the different perspectives and the knowledge from folks who have done in different sectors, who have information on how tiny homes would have to fit into each sector. And I think if somebody does go forward with it, it'll be stronger because of these conversations. So thank you. So I don't know if Mary Howard is still here, but I have to say that being the last panel of the day and being 4 program officers from foundations, that government spot after lunch is looking pretty good to me right now. Brad says there's a lot of people still here. I think it's either, I think you're all looking forward to seeing the model in a few minutes, so we won't stand in your way for that too long. I'm joined up here by my colleagues, Brad White, who is the Associate Director of the Alphawood Foundation, Deborah Bennett, who is a Senior Program Officer and my colleague at Polk Brothers Foundation, and Heather Smith, who is a Senior Program Officer at Field Foundation of Illinois. And they each come with experience previous to the current job that they're in urban planning and community development, and they will talk with you a little bit in a minute about how that has influenced the work that they do now and how it fits in with the portfolio in which they work. But I want to start the conversation by asking Brad what interested the Alphawood Foundation in being the lead sponsor of the international competition, the Tiny Homes Model competition, because they are responsible for that. So Brad, tell us that.
Well, I think a little bit of it is probably some of my interest in housing. Before I became the associate director of the Alphawood Foundation, I was in affordable housing for about 15 years, and have done a variety of work on CHA transformation projects as well as other low-income housing tax credit projects. But really, this is an intersection of many interests that Alphawood has, and they include architecture and design, healthy communities, our advocacy. We do support some advocacy organizations on housing, LGBTQ issues. As I think everyone knows, the LGBTQ youth comprise a large proportion of the overall youth homelessness issues here in Chicago and elsewhere across the country, and then just homelessness itself. We also think it's an interesting way to address homeless challenges in the community. It's an interesting way to address youth homeless challenges, but I think as the last panel showed, there's a lot of work that still has to be done and that we have to learn about before we all just jump into making tiny homes the solution. I don't think any of us think it is the solution for youth homelessness.
Thanks. And also, I think Brad just alluded to it, but in addition to the homes themselves, there are many other things that go into success in a young person's life or in anyone's life. And we haven't talked today, it's not the focus today, but we are well aware that employment, living wage jobs, career opportunities are an important part of this, as are education and all of the other areas in which many of our foundations fund and support. So Deborah and Heather, why don't you talk a little bit about your work at your foundations and how they support housing and supportive services in housing.
Thank you for the invitation. So the Polk Brothers Foundation Board has always intuitively understood the importance of a safe, decent, affordable housing to all life outcomes before, all of the research that we now have that supports that. But about 11 years ago, after a planning process that included a variety of stakeholders, including Brad, the foundation decided to prioritize the preservation of affordable rental housing, primarily because that is more cost effective than building new housing. It's a greener approach to the issue. So as a result of that, we increased our funding to nonprofit housing developers. These developers told us that they could access the funding for bricks and mortar, but they needed resources for organizational development. So we had a small technical assistance program that helped them with, IT or board development, what other kind of issues they identified. We brought in a national organization to provide training on year 15 exit strategies, which is a very complicated process in order to preserve existing affordable housing. To elevate the issue, we worked with LISC and began presenting an affordable rental housing preservation award at the Chicago Neighborhood Development Awards. We made that award, we made nonprofit as well as for-profit developers eligible for that award because we know that much of the affordable housing exists naturally in the market. So again, in order to just elevate the issue of how important the preservation of existing housing is, we did that. And now we continue, Debbie and I co-lead our housing program at the Polk Brothers Foundation, and we continue to grant $3 million a year in the areas of affordable and supportive housing.
Thank you for the opportunity. The mission of the Field Foundation is to provide support for community, civic, and cultural organizations in Chicago, enabling both new and established organizations to test innovations, expand proven strengths, or address specific time-limited operational needs. So our board really views themselves as venture capitalists, and to that end, we provide support for a variety of new innovative programs. We generally don't do general operating support, so what we do is provide small grants to organizations testing new programs or coming up with new innovations for up to 3 years. So I handle most of the affordable housing grants that come in the door, and we tend to be very responsive when it comes to our grant making. We have 6 broad categories of grant making, and we do about $3 million a year for our total portfolio in grant making. But we really view all the issues as extremely interconnected, and we view an investment in affordable housing and how that can have just as much of an impact on education or crime reduction or health. And so we really try to listen to what our grantees say that they are looking for, what they need, and be responsive to that. We don't do very much direction. And so to that end, we've made a lot of investments in a number of different organizations across the city. We've done support for homeless services. We've done a number of support for direct service providers. We've also helped with a lot of human capital positions as well. That tends to be a lot of our grant making is supporting new part-time or new full-time positions, but that can be for supportive housing, for homelessness prevention, for youth homelessness. We've also supported organizations that play an active role in voicing policy needs for affordable housing, and a lot of fair housing work as well. As a lot of you know, our executive director, Ori Pennick, has a long history in fair housing, so we do a lot of that work as well. Thank you.
Thanks. Hello? Oh. I really like karaoke. Maybe we'll save that for the end. My colleagues mentioned some of the ways that foundations support this work, and Heather just mentioned some of the systems and advocacy work around fair housing. There were a couple things that got mentioned earlier today that I think are particularly important, issues of racial equity, and I think the impact of drug policy are things that need to be addressed when we think about homelessness and housing in this particular population. And so those are areas that I hope we will have continued and further conversations about as well. So I'm going to ask a few questions, and I'll ask one of each of you, but if others of you have something to add, then please feel free to do so. I'm wondering what you think about gaps in the current housing and homeless system, and whether there are certain things that exist now. And Brad, do you want to comment on that first?
Yeah, I need that. I will take this from the standpoint of housing production. I don't claim to know as much about the service side as probably others up here do. But I think there are significant gaps. I think, first of all, there are gaps in leadership in the city on housing issues in general, and I think we saw that today by the panel where there was a city representative. I think that Chicago has not provided the appropriate resources to address housing. I don't think it has a very good housing plan. The CHA's plan for transformation, and I forget what it's called now, has some gaps in it as well, and I don't think that they're addressing the needs of people who actually do qualify for public housing. And then there's a significant lack of diversity of housing and housing types, and at all levels. There's affordable housing there's a broad spectrum of affordable housing. It goes from homeless to people who are teachers in our schools and firefighters and police officers that service our city. And we do not do a good job of meeting any of those, but I don't think we do a good job of mixing those. And I think overall my perspective is I wish the mayor would pay as much attention to housing as he has to the Lucas Museum.
Yeah, I just build on Brad's comments around production. I mean, the gap is in supply. Supply of affordable and supportive housing just has not kept up with demand. The DePaul Housing Center says we're going to need 200,000 more units that we don't have by 2020. Another gap is income. Rents have been rising while our wages have remained stagnant. And so in Chicago, you need to make between $16 to $18 an hour to afford the average two-bedroom apartment without being cost burdened, which is paying more than 30% of your income for rent. And half the people in Chicago, half the renters in Chicago are rent burdened. So there's a real, there's just a lack of supply of affordable housing. And then, Debbie leads our homelessness prevention funding, but I do know that there's a lack of funding for services. So even if we could get the housing built, we still need to be able to support services that people need to remain stably housed, and that funding has been ever increasing as well.
Building on what Brad and Deborah said, I really echo that there's a huge gap in terms of government transparency and particularly accountability. We see this particularly from the Chicago Housing Authority. And I want to applaud the work that Chicago Housing Initiative and their coalition is doing to expose a lot of that. As well, I think there's some huge gaps in terms of fair housing. And thinking about where the opportunity areas are and getting people to work with landlords and also work with tenants in the area of fair housing. And then, of course, the funding, given the state budget, but also a lot of the federal dollars coming through. just to provide support for more affordable housing and getting more affordable housing stock in Chicago.
And I appreciated the comments of our really terrific service providers who spoke before us. And somebody said it before them too, but and I know Jerry specifically said, they're stretched, and asking them to do more is challenging in the current environment. There are many things that they need. One of the things that they've been talking about a lot for serving the youth that they currently serve is more clinical services, clinical mental health services. And so I think when we think about costs and new projects, we have to think about all of those things that go along with the provision of them as well. When you hear about new housing or a new program like tiny homes, what kinds of questions come to mind? What do you look for in programs or new projects that you support? Brad says go that way.
All right, we'll start this on this end. So in terms of speaking from the Field Foundation, since we really put our primary focus on funding new programs or innovative programs, and by new we mean in the last 1 to 3 years, we really ask a lot of questions about what are the new costs. Because we aren't able to use our resources for general operating support, we look for, ask questions around what are the costs that distinguish those from what organizations are already doing. And then we also try to see, again, I mentioned we do a lot of support for new human capital, try to see if there's new positions we can support as part of those new innovations. As far as other questions, we want to make sure that organizations have the capacity to carry out a new program and pull it off. We know it's hard and time-consuming to launch a new program, and so we look at an organization's track record or history of that. But we also pride ourselves as a foundation on taking risks and being willing to be one of the first investors in a new program or new idea and help support that along the way. So it depends on the program or organization, but we really try to keep an open mind and allow ourselves to try to understand what that innovation is and how it will benefit the community.
I would say our questions are similar. We want to know, does the organization understand the landscape in which it's working? Has this been done before anywhere else? What happened? What was learned? Does the organization have the leadership and capacity to implement the project? Does it make sense? Have the people most impacted been involved in the planning of the work? And is there a plan to measure and effectively communicate outcomes?
Yeah, I think just to add on a little bit, in my opening remarks, I didn't talk about Alphawood's work in housing. We don't do a lot of work in housing. This is one of our, not one of our first ventures, but one of a few ventures into housing. And one of the first questions we asked about it was, okay, we're targeting homelessness, youth homelessness with this, but how would it impact other homeless populations, as well as how else it could be used? So we see with tiny homes the possibility that it could be used for a broad spectrum of affordable housing. I think that the services panel raised a few issues with how it could be or how it should be used with youth homelessness, and I think those are valid issues. But I also think there are a bunch of ways that tiny homes could be used to address issues of affordable housing.
Deborah, I'm going to start with you on this question because Polk Brothers Foundation is a long-term supporter of organizations and tends to provide support for many years if a program is doing effective work. And so I'm curious about how you balance funding new projects versus ongoing programs that we've been supporting.
So I do think that there needs to be a healthy balance between providing risk capital for new ideas, but also it's very important to support programs and solutions that we know are working. So I think at Polk Brothers Foundation, we don't consider it either or necessarily. We hope that our grantees are innovating around solutions constantly, and they often do request support for different projects. About 20% of our portfolio does not return to us every year for funding, so that gives us a bit of flexibility to support new programs. And we also have a relatively new enhanced capacity program area that particularly if organizations are innovating around systems change, or if they're coming to us to support a cohort of our grantees approaching a problem in a different way, then we can fund them through that program area.
Great. Yeah.
Primarily, Brett, do you want to add to that? So private foundations, obviously fund programs and make grants, but in addition to that, what are the unique roles that we can play as private funders to help move initiatives forward?
Well, I think this conference is an example of what foundations can do. We can bring attention to an issue or a solution. We can elevate that. Certainly, back in the old days, a foundation was supposed to, support the new and innovative ideas and prove it, and then government would take it over. Well, that's not happening anymore. So again, I think we need to support those new and innovative ideas, but pilot projects, demonstration projects, but then be prepared to continue to provide sustaining support.
Great. I think some of the unique roles we can play at Field in terms of being on the front end is really helping invest in new innovations, new programs, and hopefully that will leverage other sources of funding and getting the word out to programs. Often, a lot of what I find myself doing, and it's a pleasure, is connecting people who are doing similar work, but maybe in different, somewhat siloed areas, and they may not have thought to connect with one another. So that's another thing I feel that the foundation world can bring. And then I think, as Deborah mentioned, just forums like this one, helping to highlight the work of grantees and showcasing different new innovations that are happening, and hopefully publicizing those and getting more funding for them.
Well, and I think what's unique about tiny homes is that you have a project, I don't want to put total development cost numbers into anybody's mouths, but if we're talking about homes that we can build for $80,000 to $90,000 each, maybe $100,000, and you can do 6 on a lot, and you can get a lot for $1 from the city, maybe that would be their one contribution, other than making it more difficult than it needs to be in the building department and zoning departments. But if you could do that, that's of a size where actually foundations could get involved without, and getting a few foundations together so that we each have some skin in the game. Or it's of a size where you could implement a project-related investment, a PRI. Now, I don't know if any of us up here are the organizations that would consider doing PRIs. But it is a way so that you could get below market financing for a project and also put in some probably risk capital to it as well. But it's one of the things that's attractive, because now with affordable housing and the cost at $400,000 a unit, and to make it work when you're building a multifamily building, you need 50 or 60 units. That gets up to the size where the contribution by a foundation is insignificant in many cases.
And also, clearly, Brad thinks that as a funder, a unique role is being able to say things that other people may not feel comfortable saying.
I did that before I was a funder.
There's fewer ramifications, though, probably now. So we did talk a little bit. I mean, we're in an incredibly difficult environment in our state based on our state budget stalemate and based on fiscal challenges in the city. So I just wonder if you feel, besides financially, that there are how that makes things particularly challenging, but then also if it means that there are any opportunities in this area right now.
So again, I would say the major challenge is just production and just the demand for affordable and supportive housing is increasing in an era of diminishing resources. I was going to say cost was an issue. I always quote $300,000 a unit. Brad is saying $400,000. That's just ridiculous. And now that the housing market is beginning to recover, you know, we have pressures on affordable housing that we haven't had for the past few years. But again, condo conversions, opt-outs, rising rents, and strong markets. But in many low and moderate income communities, you know, we have high unemployment, abandonment, declining but continuing foreclosures. So that all makes affordable housing development difficult because developers often can't get access to capital that they need to build housing in those areas.
I think it's fairly obvious, you know, given the state budget and the city, just the enormous challenge ahead of all of us. But I do think there's some real opportunities in some creative partnerships. And I see a lot of organizations working together. Even, I think on the last panel, the panelists spoke about the building a tiny house movement that would need to be a coordinated partnership. So I see some real innovations there. I also see, again, in the realm of fair housing, the new HUD rule for affirmatively furthering fair housing, I see a lot of opportunities there, and some other policy changes. So I think moving ahead, there are some glimmers of opportunity even amidst the kind of depressing news we read on the fiscal health of the state every day.
So I forgot to talk about opportunities. Glass half full. I think there's an opportunity around reframing housing. So, you know, we know that there's been a diminishment of government resources. Some foundations have, over the past several years, have gotten out of housing. But there's an opportunity to reframe housing as a platform for other issues that funders may be interested in. We know that decent, safe, affordable housing is a platform for positive health outcomes, positive educational outcomes. It reduces recidivism, and you know, this is not only, we have studies that can prove this now. So I think it opens up the opportunity for education funders who care about the academic outcomes of Chicago public school children to potentially fund housing. Health funders who care about the health of people in communities to potentially fund housing. And I think on a policy level, a lot is happening around Medicaid and the Affordable Care Act that resources that were generally for health can now be used to build affordable housing. So again, we don't live in silos, but funders often fund in silos. And I believe there's a beginning recognition that we need to fund more holistically and really look at the intersections between all of the issues that we care about.
Thank you. We do want to answer and take questions, so we hope that you will have some for us. If you don't, Ethany, we're also willing to take just comments, so anybody who wants to come up and just tell us what they think, this is really a wonderful opportunity to do that, and we hope that you will too. Just in terms of the opportunities, I am, in light of our current environment, I'm always surprised and delighted by the number of new organizations and burgeoning ideas, and people come to our foundations all the time looking to launch new programs and start new programs, and very inspired by all of you and excited about some of the things that I know that you're thinking about launching right now, and look forward to trying to be helpful with them. Any questions?
Could have just talked. The previous panel used the word continuum a lot, and I've heard the word continue from some of the things you've been saying. When you're looking at this as a potential for funding, what filter do you use as beyond the scope of what this project is? And when you're looking at tiny housing and a finite period of time that these recipients might be in this housing, is there something that you base your decisions on as far as where do these recipients go after they leave these tiny houses, after they leave some of this programming? And perhaps this was more appropriate for the previous panel, but I do kind of wonder if as you're considering your funding opportunities and these new programs, do you really think about what happens to these recipients and in this case, youth homeless after the age of 24, if we're looking at, back to that 18 to 24 age range? Thank you.
I'll take a first stab. So the Polk Brothers Foundation's housing program area is a continuum. So we fund from homelessness prevention to affordable housing development to affordable home ownership. And so we are always interested and ask our grantees about, quote unquote, graduation strategy. So how does a person or a family move from maybe getting supportive housing, but how are they stabilized and hopefully, maybe the family can get a job and then move on into affordable housing and then, maybe home ownership one day. So we see our grant making as a continuum.
We're interested from a variety of programmatic standpoints of what happens to people after they exit a particular program. And so we always ask organizations, how long they track participants and have conversations about that. Understanding every population is very different and every population has its challenges. But we do look at that as part of the grant making process and try to understand too that programs may go in a different direction after they're launched. And we don't necessarily penalize grantees for that. We even say that explicitly on our final report form. Just tell us what went well, tell us what didn't go so well, what challenges or surprises you had along the way.
I think it also depends what you are funding, because some of us support organizations with general operating and don't generally do program support, and some organizations may support the development of the housing itself. So it depends, what you're looking at, whether it's general operating support, capital contributions, or program support itself.
And I think all of the providers that are working with homeless youth are thinking very hard about what happens to them next and how to create long-term sustainable solutions. Casey's research is interesting and sobering. Voices of Youth Count was mentioned. It's a new national study. it is going to provide more quantitative information, but it's also doing some qualitative research on best practices, and it's going to be making some policy recommendations for moving forward. But I think the idea is whatever the most stable and independent life somebody can lead is, and I say that carefully because we all do. None of us are truly independent. We all rely quite a bit on our systems, and we all have moved around a lot over the years. So I think that's an important piece of it. But it's thinking about how to provide somebody with the most resources possible. And again, I think employment is a huge part of that, and career opportunities. And I don't know, Deborah, do you want to add anything about the employment piece? No. Okay. Mike?
Hi. So first of all, I just want to say thank you to Brad, because what I heard was that you just promised that Alphawood would do 6 units of tiny houses. So everybody, let's give Brad a big round of applause. So
is Jim in the room?
Actual question is, it seems to me, just from kind of listening through the day and kind of talking to people throughout, there's a number of smaller organizations that are seeing this as a real viable opportunity and are sort of seeking a way to do that. And then there's a whole series of panelists and other people, such as myself and others, who are saying, well, it's pretty tricky. It's Chicago. Like, there's this whole thing about zoning codes and blah, blah, blah. And so there's this kind of leap between, and it feels like there has to be some risky money in there that is that kind of pre-development funds that allows somebody to go in, an organization that wouldn't normally be able to pay for a zoning lawyer or something, and actually get that to happen. That once something becomes kind of gets through that process, if it can get through the process, and that's the risky part, is that then all the others would fall in behind. Am I reading that right? Is that something that you guys see as like something that the foundations can be helpful in, that kind of risky money up front for something like this?
I think there does need to be some risky money. I think there's a lot to fall into place. Some of the people missing here today, I don't see any aldermanic representation. It's not a criticism of anyone who put this together. It's just an observation. And we're going to need aldermanic support to get this done. But one of the other things, Mike, you said, where Alphawood, have we committed to the 6 units? I think that what we have to recognize, and Andy Gear talked about a financially viable solution, and a financially viable solution is not having foundations pay for all of the tiny homes units. And I know you were saying that facetiously, but I think it's important to point that out, that yes, I think there's an important role for foundations in this mix. There's an important role to get things rolling, but we have to find a financially viable structure so that because foundations will not work if it has to all be done based on contributions.
I would just add to that, yes, I think that there is a role for foundations to play in doing exactly the kind of thing that you just said, Mike, like providing support for an attorney to an organization that might not have that. Risk capital is really important. I would say that where we are in this conversation, and I'm, would look to all of you for these answers too, but I don't know that we're there yet. I think that the questions and concerns raised in this room today are great and important parts of the conversation, as do I think that the enthusiasm for moving forward are. But I think, I would like to see whoever decides to take this on, talk more with some of the people about the concerns that they have and understand more what the challenges would be before going forward. But if somebody has a plan, then yeah, I think it would be, interesting to take a risk. Again, considering what's thought through. I mean, because the other part of it is if we are talking about this for youth, there is the comprehensive services piece of it. And we are in a challenging position right now, and we have some really terrific, strong service providers, but I don't know that they have the capacity to take this on right now. So, those are the kinds of questions that I would have.
And another approach to this, and I wasn't here for the earlier discussion, but we also fund housing advocacy organizations. So maybe there's a role for those zoning laws to be changed to make them more amenable to this type of development.
Another comment too is I think that there's an enormous opportunity for collaboration among all the different organizations to put this together. But as Brad mentioned earlier, it really is a scale issue. If the average unit cost is $400,000, a Field Foundation grant would be a drop in the bucket for that. So it's really about putting together appropriate financing and perhaps even engaging or definitely engaging the private sector as well. In my previous life at the Congress for the New Urbanism, we worked as part of the post-Katrina charrettes, and one of the designers built what was called the Katrina Cottage, a 600 square foot home, and engaged Lowe's to build that as a kit home. So that's just another idea out there of engaging the private sector to help bring that product to the market and hopefully lower the cost.
So we'll just take one final question.
Sorry,
two final questions. Thank you.
I was there with Tracy and Kim back when we did the Homeless Youth Summit almost 2 years ago. And this Christmas, past Christmas, December 2015, I saw one of the youth who participated in that summit and lended their voice there still receiving services as a homeless youth. And so I'd like to go back to what I think some of the people from Seattle were saying earlier today and say, where's the urgency and what can cause more urgency on the part of everyone in this problem?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how to answer that question. I'm hoping the urgency is in this room. There's a lot to do. There's a lot more to be done. But I hope that these kinds of conversations are part of that solution.
I would just hope that no one walks away today only hearing the things that were challenges to getting things done. Because the way I look at Danielle, who was the zoning attorney, you all remember she had all those tabs. I look at, that's great. She's already done the work ahead of time for some people. Now how do we address those tabs? And I look at that across the board, even with the challenges that were raised by the service providers. We've got challenges. We need to address some of those issues, probably address all those issues, and figure out how to move forward. Because we have to move forward on this issue, whether we're addressing it with tiny homes or some other type of housing. So.
But, I always think of my friend Fred Friedman, who some of you know, who is a person with lived experience and has participated in many of the conversations around homelessness and the city's plan to end homelessness. And, he always says, we don't have time. We do not have time. There are people living on the streets right now, and as Lara said earlier, it is not okay. It is inexcusable in a society like ours. And so we do have to do everything that we can, and we have to do it as fast as we can.
This is more to do with tiny living, but also urgency. And I'm just a conversation. If you've researched the development of SRO rehabs in the city, because the Wilson Men's Hotel is up for sale and has till the end of the month. It houses 180 people on 2 city lots. And it's prime for development. And the alternative is you get 3 people that can live anywhere and now have a condo in place of where, 180 live. So, it's a tiny living, it's not tiny homes, but I mean, also rehab is an alternative of building new, you're wasting less materials, things like this. I just wonder how much you have worked in rehab and SROs, if you can comment to that at all.
So I would say, advocacy has been very important in preserving SROs, and there is the SRO preservation ordinance that I know many organizations worked on that. The Polk Brothers Foundation funded One Northside. I hear you're in the House. Are you still in the House? One Northside to help work on that. And earlier someone talked about finding a mission-oriented developer. And so...
not in my backyard mentality with a lot of the neighbors, the aldermans against it.
Yeah, you have to overcome the NIMBYism, yes. And I think part of that is the answer to the urgency question as well. I don't know. Somehow, as Americans, we feel like if people are not doing well, that it is, something that they did. And we're always blaming the victim and not looking at our larger systems. And so. And our systems that cause inequity. And so, I think, we have to figure out how to change hearts and minds in order to really address the issue of lack of housing in the United States, the richest country in the world. Yeah, I think developers, I think mission-minded developers are attractive, but it has to make sense economically, right? I'm going to turn it over to the developer.
There are a lot of issues with economically. The person who owns it wants to sell it, and a mission-minded developer is not going to be able to pay as much for it, likely, as a condo developer or a market-rate apartment developer. But again, I think we have to get to some leadership at the government level as well. I think there are other places in this country where SRO development is respected more and is protected more than it is in this city. The city has been unwilling to do anything about it. So market forces are going to take over in cases like this, and there's not a lot that can be done unless the advocates, because the advocates don't have the resources either.
Thank you. So I want to thank my colleagues for being up here and speaking today, and I want to thank all of you for your dedication and passion and commitment to all of these issues and your continued work. Thank you.
Thank you. And to the person who just asked that question, for sure, contact One Northside. That's perfectly right in their wheelhouse. That's what they do. So One Northside is your best bet on that. Thank you.
Tour's coming, yes. So let's give the day and all the speakers a round of applause. Yeah. This has just been phenomenal. This has been one of those if you build it, they will come kind of situations. Everybody we asked to participate said yes. And so that's why we had such a packed schedule. I want to do a couple things. One is I just want to go through a few takeaways from the day. And I'll just list them out in no particular order. That we have a 97% service gap when it comes to dealing with youth who are experiencing homelessness. Housing programs and developments need to be relational, not transactional. Change of mind happens at a greater speed than speed of light plus speed of sound. Political will is needed. We need champions. Partnerships, partnerships, partnerships. There will always be something to slow you down. With tiny home communities, we have to figure out how to provide safety for the residents and invite people in. There's an openness to tiny homes by the government agencies that we had here today. We must establish a broader marketplace for tiny homes, and that may mean bringing together several movements or issue areas. We need a variety of housing options. We need that mission-driven developer plus a site, plus site control and a sympathetic alderman. We need more data on youth experiencing homelessness. And if you can make tiny homes work in Chicago, you can make tiny homes work anywhere. So, with that in mind, I hope that most of you can come back tomorrow. We will have a few more sessions. Ethne is going to talk about her project. We're going to hear more about the design competition and a few other things. But one of the things we're going to end that day with is some next steps, some concrete next steps, and we need everybody's help in defining those and then in coming together to make those happen. I want to remind you to please, please, please fill out these evaluation forms. It is very important that we get your comments and your assessment on how the day went. And I know Tracy is going, well, first of all, I would be remiss if I did not say, let us give Tracy Boehm a round of applause for her. This woman here, she does not take no or can't as answers, so we will have tiny homes. No, we will have tiny homes in Chicago because you said there will be tiny homes in Chicago. And I believe you. And Tracy's got a whole list of folks to thank, but I want to give a special shout out to our volunteers. We had volunteers from AmeriCorps, from Salesforce. We had a bunch of other volunteers who are just our friends and people who just love us. AFC, AIDS Foundation of Chicago staff was here. Joshua in particular running around with that microphone. And there is also a very special someone who is way more comfortable behind the scenes than with a microphone in her hand, and that is the incomparable Jackie Thaney in the back there. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you again to Polk Brothers Foundation and Debbie Reznick for sponsoring the summit, our additional partners, UIC Gender and Sexuality Center for getting this space for us today, Megan, Daisy, Laura, Alphawood Foundation, Windy City Times, AIDS Foundation of Chicago, AIA Chicago, Landon Bone Baker, Price Construction, Mallory, the daughter of David Price, is sitting over here. You're going to see their work, but Mallory is the reason that she got her father to do the build with us. So yes. Mallory used to work at Chicago House, so she knows these issues. And Lynn Mathis Construction. I'm going to end, I had some other remarks, but I'm not going to say them. I'll write it later. But I do want to end because we are so appropriately located right now in time and space next to the Jane Addams Hull House. For those who don't know, the first American woman to win the Nobel Peace Prize. And here she said this more than 100 years ago in 1910 of Hull House. The settlement is an experimental effort to aid in the solution of the social and industrial problems which are engendered by the modern conditions of life in a great city. It insists that these problems are not confined to any one portion of the city. It is an attempt to relieve at the same time the overaccumulation at one end of society and the destitution of the other. She also said that private beneficence is totally inadequate to deal with the vast numbers of the city's disinherited. We heard that on the last panel. This must be a government solution as well. We cannot rely on private to solve this. So thank you for being here. Please come back tomorrow. We're videotaping the entire conference for your friends who missed it. So if you can't make it tomorrow, we'll definitely have it on tape. Now join us to see this amazing tiny home. Yes.